June 28, 2024, the day Venezuela crossed the Rubicon. Let me tell you about the moment that, in hindsight, will mark the point of no return for Venezuela and, more importantly, for the entire Western Hemisphere. It wasn't the fiery speech by Nicolas Maduro in Caracas, nor was it the immediate condemnation from Washington. No, it was the quiet, almost bureaucratic announcement from the Venezuelan National Electoral, the indefinite postponement of the presidential election originally scheduled for July 28. At first glance, this looks like just another authoritarian delay in a country where democracy has been on life support for years. But here's what the headlines won't tell you: this isn't just about Venezuela. This is about the unraveling of American hegemony in its own backyard, the final collapse of the Monroe Doctrine as a viable foreign policy, and the first real test of whether the United States still has the will or the capacity to enforce its vision of global order. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of geopolitics and resource competition, and I can tell you what's happening in Venezuela right now isn't a crisis. It's a symptom. A symptom of a superpower stretched too thin, of a world order fracturing under the weight of its own contradictions, and of a region that has learned the hard way that Washington's promises are only as good as its ability to deliver. And right now, that ability is in serious doubt. So let's start with the story they're telling you, the one you've probably read in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or heard on CNN. The official narrative goes something like: Venezuela, under the increasingly repressive regime of Nicolas Maduro, has once again delayed its presidential election, this time under the pretext of foreign interference and electoral irregularities. The United States, along with its allies in the Lima Group and the European Union, has condemned the move as a blatant violation of democratic norms. The Biden administration, already under pressure from Florida's Venezuelan exile community, has responded with targeted sanctions, freezing the assets of key Venezuelan officials and threatening to reimpose the full oil embargo that was temporarily lifted last year in a failed bid to incentivize free and fair elections. The numbers seem to back up the outrage. According to the Venezuelan opposition, over 7 million people have fled the country since 2015, creating one of the worst refugee crises in modern history. Inflation, though slightly stabilized, still hovers around 200% annually. Oil production, once the lifeblood of the economy, has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today, despite sitting on the largest proven oil reserves in the world. And then there's the human rights arbitrary detentions, political prisoners, and a judiciary that answers to the executive branch. By any objective measure, Venezuela is a failed state, and Maduro is a dictator clinging to power through brute force and electoral manipulation. But here's the problem with this: it's not wrong, but it's incomplete. And in geopolitics, what you leave out is often more important than what you include. Let's start with the timing. Why now? Why, after years of economic collapse and international isolation, does Maduro suddenly feel emboldened to cancel an election that he was never going to win fairly anyway? The answer lies in 3 ESS. The Essequibo region, a 160,000 square kilometer territory controlled by Guyana but claimed by Venezuela for over a century. In December 2023, Maduro held a referendum in which 95% of voters approved the annexation of Essequibo. Within weeks, Venezuelan troops began military exercises near the border, and Maduro announced the creation of a new Guayana Essequibo state, complete with its own governor. The international community, predictably, condemned the move. The U.S. responded by conducting joint military exercises with Guyana, deploying a naval destroyer to the region, and reaffirming its commitment to defend Guyana's territorial integrity under the 1966 Geneva Agreement. At first glance, this looks like classic Maduro posturing, distracting from domestic failures by manufacturing an external enemy. But here's where it gets interesting. The Essequibo isn't just any disputed territory. It's home to some of the largest offshore oil discoveries in the world, with ExxonMobil estimating reserves of at least 11 billion barrels. And who's been drilling there? Exxon, of course, along with Chevron and a consortium of Chinese and Indian firms. The U.S. Energy Information Administration now ranks Guyana as the fastest-growing oil producer in the world, with output expected to hit 1.2 million barrels per day by 2027. For context, that's more than Venezuela's current production, and it's happening in a territory that Venezuela has never recognized as sovereign. Now, let's connect the dots. In October 2023, the Biden administration surprised everyone by partially lifting sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold free elections. The deal was brokered by Norway and involved secret back-channel negotiations with the Venezuelan government. At the time, I warned that this was a mistake, that Maduro would pocket the concessions and then renege on his commitments, just as he had done in 2019 after the failed humanitarian aid stunt at the Colombian border. And that's exactly what happened. But here's what no one in Washington seems to have: Maduro didn't just want sanctions relief. He wanted leverage. And the Essequibo dispute gave him exactly that. Think about it. By escalating tensions with Guyana, Maduro forced the U.S. to choose between two bad: either abandon Guyana to Venezuelan aggression, or double down on military support for Guyana and risk a direct confrontation with Venezuela. The Biden administration, already weakened by the Ukraine war and the looming election, chose the latter. But here's the: every dollar in every drone sent to Guyana is a dollar and a drone not available for Taiwan or the South China Sea. And that's not an accident. It's strategy. Because Venezuela isn't acting alone. Let me be clear about Maduro is not a geopolitical mastermind. He's a survivor, and like all survivors, he's learned to play the weak hand he's been dealt. And right now, his hand is being strengthened by two players who have a vested interest in seeing the US bogged down in its own: Russia and China. Let's start with Russia. In March 2024, just weeks after the Essequibo crisis began, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited Caracas and signed a series of military and economic agreements, including the deployment of Russian technical advisors to Venezuela's oil fields and the sale of advanced air defense systems. This wasn't just a routine diplomatic visit. It was: if the US pushes too hard on Venezuela, Russia will push back. And they're not just talking about sanctions. In 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of force. In 2020, it deployed mercenaries from the Wagner Group to protect Maduro. And in 2023, it began supplying Venezuela with the same electronic warfare systems it's used in Ukraine to jam NATO communications. The Russians aren't in Venezuela out of altruism. They're there because they see it as a pressure point, a way to force the US to divide its attention and resources. Then there's China. Beijing has been Venezuela's lifeline for over a decade, providing billions in loans secured by oil shipments. But in the last 2 years, China's role has shifted from creditor to strategic partner. In 2022, China and Venezuela signed a 25-year cooperation agreement covering everything from infrastructure to military technology. In 2023, China began constructing a deep-water port in Venezuela's Falcon State, just 300 miles from the U.S. coast, a move that has set off alarm bells in Washington. And in early 2024, Chinese state-owned firms started drilling in Venezuela's Orinoco Belt, the largest oil reserve in the world, using technology that could double Venezuela's production within a decade. The message from Beijing is: we're not just investing in Venezuela's oil. We're investing in Venezuela's future as a counterweight to U.S. influence in the region. Now, let's out. What we're seeing in Venezuela isn't just a local crisis. It's a microcosm of the broader struggle between a declining unipolar power and the rising multipolar order. The U.S. has spent the last 30 years acting as if the post-Cold War world order was permanent, that its military dominance, its dollar hegemony, and its network of alliances would ensure its primacy indefinitely. But that world order is crumbling, and Venezuela is one of the places where the cracks are most visible. Consider the historical parallels. In 1962, the U.S. faced down the Soviet Union over missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The crisis was resolved through back-channel diplomacy, but the lesson was the U.S. would not tolerate a rival power establishing a military foothold in its hemisphere. Fast forward to 2024, and the situation is eerily similar, except this time, it's not just one rival power. It's two. And they're not just deploying missiles. They're building ports, drilling for oil, and propping up a regime that openly defies U.S. authority. The difference? In 1962, the U.S. had the economic and military capacity to enforce its will. Today, it doesn't. The U.S. is still the world's largest economy, but its share of global GDP has fallen from 35% in 1990 to under 25% today. Its military is stretched thin by 2 decades of war in the Middle East, a proxy war in Ukraine, and the looming threat of conflict with China over Taiwan. And its political system is so polarized that even the most basic foreign policy decisions, like whether to send aid to Ukraine, have become hostage to domestic squabbles. This is the context in which Venezuela's decision to cancel its election must be understood. Maduro isn't just defying the U.S. He's testing its resolve. And so far, the test is revealing something: the U.S. no longer has the leverage it once did. The sanctions that crippled Venezuela's economy in the 2010s are now being circumvented by Russia and China. The military threats that once made Latin American strongmen think twice are now met with Russian bombers and Chinese ports. And the diplomatic pressure that once isolated regimes like Cuba and Nicaragua is now being ignored, as more and more countries in the global south refuse to take sides in the US-China rivalry. Let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get really dangerous. The US has already deployed a carrier strike group to the Caribbean in response to the Essequibo crisis, and it's conducting joint exercises with Guyana's military. But here's the: Venezuela isn't Iraq or Afghanistan. It's not a country that can be invaded and occupied with a few 100,000 troops. Venezuela has a population of 28 million, a standing army of 120,000, and a well-armed militia of over 2 million. It's also one of the most urbanized countries in Latin America, with over 80% of its population living in cities. Any military intervention would be a logistical nightmare, with high casualties and no clear exit strategy. And that's before we even consider the Russian and Chinese response. If the US were to launch airstrikes or a ground invasion, Russia has already signaled that it would respond by increasing its military support for Venezuela. China, meanwhile, has warned that any attack on Venezuela would be considered an attack on its economic interests. Now, I'm not saying that Russia or China would go to war with the US over Venezuela. But they don't have to. All they have to do is make the cost of intervention so high that the US backs down. And in an election year, with a president already facing low approval ratings, that's exactly what they're counting on. The hawks in Washington will tell you that the US can't afford to back down, that doing so would embolden other adversaries and signal weakness. And they're not entirely wrong. But here's what they're not telling: the US can't afford to escalate either. Every dollar spent on Venezuela is a dollar not spent on Taiwan. Every drone sent to Guyana is a drone not available for the South China Sea. And every moment of attention focused on Caracas is a moment not spent preparing for the real long-term of China that is rapidly surpassing the US in economic, technological, and military power. This is the paradox of American power in the 21st century. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, but its power is no longer absolute. It's relative. And in a world where power is relative, every crisis is a trade-off. The question: what is Venezuela worth to the US? Is it worth risking a direct confrontation with Russia and China? Is it worth diverting resources from the Indo-Pacific? Is it worth the domestic political fallout in an election year? The answer, for now, is no. But that doesn't mean the US can ignore Venezuela either. Because the longer this crisis festers, the more it erodes American credibility. And in geopolitics, credibility is everything. Let's talk about the domestic political dimension, because this is where things get really messy. The Biden administration's Venezuela policy is being pulled in two directions. On one side, you have the Florida vote. Over 2 million Venezuelans have fled to the US since 2015, and most of them have settled in Florida, a swing state that could decide the 2024 election. These voters overwhelmingly support a hardline approach to Maduro, and they have the ear of powerful politicians like Senator Marco Rubio and Governor Ron DeSantis. On the other side, you have the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which has been pushing for a more diplomatic approach, arguing that sanctions and military threats only hurt ordinary Venezuelans and play into Maduro's hands. The result is a policy that is neither fish nor fowl, neither tough enough to satisfy the hawks nor diplomatic enough to satisfy the doves. The Biden administration has tried to thread the needle by imposing targeted sanctions while also engaging in back-channel negotiations. But this approach has failed to produce results, and now the administration is stuck. If it escalates, it risks alienating the progressive base. If it backs down, it risks losing Florida. And if it does nothing, it risks looking weak on the world stage. This is the domestic political trap that has ensnared every U.S. administration since Hugo Chavez first came to power in 1999. Venezuela has become a domestic political issue, not a foreign policy one. And when foreign policy becomes a domestic political issue, it stops being about strategy and starts being about optics. That's why we've seen so many half measures over the failed coup in 2002, the oil embargo in 2019, the recognition of Juan Guaidó as interim president. None of these moves were designed to actually solve the crisis. They were designed to make it look like the US was doing something. And that brings us to the real tragedy of Venezuela. For over 2 decades, the US has treated Venezuela as a problem to be managed, not a country to be engaged with. It has imposed sanctions that have impoverished millions while failing to dislodge Maduro. It has recognized opposition leaders who have no real power on the ground. And it has ignored the fact that Venezuela's crisis is not just a product of Maduro's authoritarianism, but also of US policy failures, from the war on drugs to the neglect of Latin America during the war on terror. So where does this leave us? Let's look at the scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. In this scenario, the US and its allies managed to pressure Maduro into holding a free and fair election by offering a grand sanctions relief in exchange for a transition to democracy. The opposition unites behind a single candidate, wins the election, and forms a government of national unity. The US lifts sanctions, international investors return, and Venezuela begins the long process of rebuilding its economy. Russia and China, seeing the writing on the wall, reduce their involvement in the country. This is the scenario that the Biden administration is hoping for. But it's also the least likely. Maduro has no incentive to hold a free election, because he knows he would lose. The opposition is divided, with no clear leader capable of uniting the anti-Maduro vote. And even if an opposition candidate were to win, Maduro would likely refuse to step down, leading to a constitutional crisis. Moreover, Russia and China have too much invested in Venezuela to simply walk away. They would do everything in their power to sabotage any transition that threatened their interests. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. In this scenario, Venezuela remains in a state of perpetual crisis, with Maduro clinging to power through a combination of repression, electoral manipulation, and external support from Russia and China. The US and its allies continue to impose sanctions, but these sanctions are increasingly ineffective as Venezuela deepens its ties with Moscow and Beijing. The economy remains in shambles, but Maduro manages to keep the military loyal through patronage and corruption. The opposition remains divided, and the international community grows increasingly frustrated but ultimately powerless to effect change. This is the scenario that we're already seeing play out. It's not a good outcome, but it's the most stable, at least in the short term. The problem is that stability in Venezuela is not the same as peace. As long as Maduro remains in power, the country will continue to be a source of instability in the region, with millions more fleeing the country and criminal gangs like the Tren de Aragua extending their reach across Latin America. And as long as Russia and China maintain their foothold in Venezuela, the US will be forced to divert resources and attention away from more pressing threats. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. In this scenario, the crisis escalates into direct military confrontation. The US, frustrated by Maduro's intransigence, launches a limited military strike against Venezuelan military targets, either in response to an attack on Guyana or as part of a broader effort to force regime change. Venezuela retaliates by attacking US assets in the region, possibly with Russian or Iranian support. Russia increases its military presence in Venezuela, and China begins supplying advanced weapons systems. The U.S. would likely respond by escalating its own military posture in the Western Hemisphere, turning Venezuela into a proxy battleground for great power competition. The risk here isn't just regional instability, it's the very real possibility of a miscalculation spiraling into something far worse. Let me explain why this scenario, while still unlikely, is no longer unthinkable. First, we have to understand the military balance in the region. Venezuela's armed forces are a shadow of what they once were, but they're not irrelevant. The country still fields around 120,000 active duty personnel, with another 200,000 in reserve and paramilitary forces. More importantly, they've been modernizing, at least selectively, with Russian and Chinese hardware. Since 2006, Venezuela has purchased over $11 billion worth of military equipment from Russia alone, including Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets, T-72 tanks, and S-300 air defense systems. China, meanwhile, has supplied radars, drones, and even helped develop Venezuela's own satellite program, the VRSS series, which has dual-use capabilities. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about raw numbers. Venezuela's military doctrine has evolved in response to perceived U.S. threats, particularly after the 2002 coup attempt and the 2019 drone attack on Maduro. The regime has invested heavily in asymmetric warfare capabilities, including cyber units trained by Russia and Iran, as well as irregular forces like the Colectivos, armed civilian groups that operate as a parallel security apparatus. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's military isn't designed to win a conventional war against the U.S. It's designed to make any intervention so costly that Washington thinks twice. And that's where the Russian and Chinese factor comes in. Moscow has already demonstrated its willingness to project power into the Western Hemisphere. In 2018, Russia sent two Tu-160 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of force, and in 2020, it deployed military advisors to help maintain Venezuela's S-300 systems. More recently, in 2023, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov explicitly warned that any U.S. military action in Venezuela would trigger a response. China, while more cautious, has also been increasing its military footprint. The PLA has conducted joint exercises with Venezuela, and in 2022, the two countries signed a defense cooperation agreement that includes intelligence sharing and cybersecurity collaboration. Now, let's talk about the U.S. side of the equation. The Pentagon has been quietly preparing for this contingency for years. In 2019, then National Security Advisor John Bolton openly discussed the possibility of military action, and U.S. Southern Command has conducted multiple exercises simulating a Venezuelan crisis, including Tradewinds and AMAX. The U.S. has also been strengthening its alliances in the region, particularly with Colombia and Guyana. Colombia, which shares a 1,300-mile border with Venezuela, has been a key partner in countering Maduro's influence, hosting U.S. military bases and even allowing the deployment of U.S. Special Forces. Guyana, meanwhile, has become a flashpoint in its own right. The discovery of massive offshore oil reserves in the Essequibo region, an area Venezuela has long claimed, has raised tensions to dangerous levels. In December 2023, Maduro held a referendum to annex Essequibo, and the U.S. responded by conducting joint military exercises with Guyana. If Venezuela were to launch even a limited incursion into Essequibo, it could trigger a U.S. military response under the Rio Treaty, which obligates signatories to collective defense. But here's where things get really messy. Any U.S. military action in Venezuela would almost certainly draw in Russia and China. Moscow has already shown it's willing to escalate in response to perceived U.S. aggression, as we saw in Syria and Ukraine. In Venezuela, Russia could deploy more advanced air defense systems, send additional military advisors, or even establish a permanent naval base, something it's been eyeing for years. China, while less likely to engage in direct military confrontation, could retaliate economically, targeting U.S. commies operating in Latin America or even weaponizing its control over critical supply chains. And let's not forget Iran, which has been deepening its ties with Venezuela in recent years. Tehran has sent oil tankers to bypass U.S. sanctions, and in 2020, it reportedly deployed Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps advisors to help train Venezuelan forces. If the U.S. were to strike Venezuela, Iran could respond by targeting U.S. interests in the Middle East, creating a multi-front crisis for Washington. The real danger, though, isn't just the immediate escalation, it's the long-term geopolitical fallout. A U.S. military intervention in Venezuela would shatter any remaining illusions about American restraint in Latin America. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, which have tried to maintain a delicate balance between Washington and Beijing, would be forced to pick sides. Russia and China would use the crisis to justify further military action in the region, turning Latin America into a new Cold War battleground. And let's not forget the domestic consequences in the U.S. itself. A protracted conflict in Venezuela would be deeply unpopular, especially if it resulted in American casualties. It could also embolden hardliners in Washington who see regime change as the only solution, leading to a self-reinforcing cycle of escalation. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome, as I've argued, is the status quo, a slow-burning crisis that never quite boils over but never truly ends. But the risk of miscalculation is real, and it's growing. The U.S. has shown a worrying tendency to underestimate the resolve of its adversaries, whether in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Ukraine. Russia and China, for their part, have demonstrated a willingness to take risks when they perceive a strategic opening. And Maduro, despite his weakness, has proven to be a survivor. He knows that as long as he can keep the military loyal and his foreign patrons engaged, he can weather almost any storm. The question, then, isn't whether Venezuela's crisis has an easy exit, it doesn't. The question is whether the world's great powers are willing to accept that reality, or whether they'll keep pushing until something breaks. And that, in the end, is the most dangerous scenario of all. Now, what most people don't realize is that the real battleground in Venezuela isn't just the streets of Caracas or the oil fields of the Orinoco, it's the barracks. The Venezuelan military has long been the ultimate arbiter of power in the country, and Maduro's survival hinges on one critical: how long can he keep the generals loyal? The answer, as always in Venezuela, is more complicated than it seems. Let me explain why this matters. The military isn't a monolith. It's a fractured institution, split between hardline Chavistas who benefit from the status quo, pragmatic officers who tolerate Maduro because they fear chaos more than they despise him, and a silent minority who might be willing to defect if they believed a transition could be managed without reprisals. The problem is that Maduro has spent the last decade systematically purging the latter group. In 2014, after a wave of protests, he arrested or forced into exile dozens of officers suspected of disloyalty. In 2017, he created the Fuerza de Acciones Especiales, a paramilitary unit answerable only to him, to counterbalance the regular armed forces. And in 2019, after Juan Guaido's failed uprising, he jailed or exiled more than 100 military personnel, including high-ranking figures like General Christopher Figuera, the former head of the intelligence service SEBIN. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro has turned the military into a patronage machine. The top brass doesn't just get political protection, they get rich. The Cartel de los Soles, a network of military officers involved in drug trafficking, has been documented by the U.S. Treasury Department since at least 2017. Generals like Cliver Alcala, Hugo Carvajal, and Nestor Reverol have been indicted in U.S. courts for narco-terrorism, yet they remain untouchable in Venezuela. The military also controls key sectors of the food distribution through the Comite Local de Abastecimiento Y production, gold mining in the south, and even the import of medical supplies. In 2020, a Reuters investigation found that the military was profiting from the sale of subsidized gasoline to smugglers, a racket worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. So why would any general risk it all for a transition? The short answer is that most won't, at least not without guarantees. And that's where the domestic political dimensions get really messy. The opposition, for all its flaws, has never been able to offer the military a credible off-ramp. Guaido's 2019 gambit failed precisely because he couldn't assure the generals that they wouldn't end up in a Miami courtroom or a Venezuelan prison. The U.S. has tried to sweeten the deal with sanctions relief, most notably in 2020, when the Trump administration offered to lift restrictions on General Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, if he defected. But Padrino, like most of the high command, knows that Maduro's fall could mean his own. The military's loyalty isn't ideological, it's transactional. And as long as Maduro can keep the money flowing, they'll keep him in power. But here's where the scenario projections get interesting. The military's calculus could shift if two things: first, if the economic collapse accelerates to the point where even the generals can't feed their families, and second, if a credible international actor, preferably one with deep pockets, steps in to guarantee their safety. The first condition is already in motion. Venezuela's GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, and hyperinflation has made the bolivar worthless. The military's economic privileges are eroding. In 2021, the government was forced to devalue the currency by 95%, wiping out the savings of even mid-ranking officers. The clap food boxes, once a reliable perk, are now filled with expired or substandard products. and the gold mining operations in the south are under threat from armed gangs and foreign mercenaries. The second condition is where things get tricky. The US has tried to play this role, but its credibility is shot. The Biden administration's mixed signals, first imposing new sanctions, then offering talks, have left the opposition and the military alike confused. The Europeans have been more consistent, but they lack the leverage to make a difference. That leaves Russia and China. Moscow has already shown a willingness to prop up Maduro, but it's not clear how far it's willing to go. In 2019, Russia sent mercenaries from the Wagner Group to protect Maduro, but those forces were withdrawn after the failed uprising. China, meanwhile, has poured billions into Venezuela, but it's increasingly frustrated by the country's instability. In 2021, Beijing quietly reduced its exposure, cutting back on oil for loans deals and refusing to bail out the state-owned oil company PDVSA. So what's the most likely scenario? I see three possibilities, none of them pretty. The first is a slow-motion collapse, where Maduro clings to power but the country becomes increasingly ungovernable. This is the status quo on steroids. The military remains loyal, but only because the alternatives are worse. The economy continues to deteriorate, and the regime relies more and more on repression to maintain control. We've seen this movie before in Zimbabwe, in Cuba, in North Korea. It's not sustainable, but it can drag on for years. The second scenario is a negotiated transition, but it's a long shot. For this to work, the opposition would need to offer the military a credible amnesty deal, and the US would need to commit to sanctions relief. The problem is that neither side trusts the other. The opposition fears that any deal with the military would be a betrayal of the democratic movement, while the military fears that any deal with the opposition would be a death sentence. The last time Venezuela tried this, during the 2019 Oslo talks, it collapsed when Maduro's negotiators demanded that the US lift all sanctions before any concessions were made. The Biden administration has since tried to revive the process, but the gaps remain too wide. The third scenario is the most: a sudden, violent rupture. This could happen if the military fractures, with one faction attempting a coup. It could also happen if the regime's repression triggers a mass uprising, as it did in 2017. The difference this time is that the opposition is weaker, the military is more divided, and the international community is more distracted. If a coup does happen, it's unlikely to be led by pro-democracy officers. More probably, it would be a power grab by a hardline faction, possibly backed by Russia or Iran. And if that happens, the US would face an impossible intervene to prevent a new authoritarian regime, or stand by and watch as Venezuela becomes a client state of Moscow or Tehran. Let me be: none of these scenarios end with Venezuela becoming a stable democracy anytime soon. The best-case outcome is a managed transition that avoids civil war and sets the stage for gradual reforms. The worst-case outcome is a failed state that becomes a haven for organized crime, terrorism, and foreign mercenaries. The most likely outcome, unfortunately, is somewhere in between: a country that remains trapped in a cycle of repression, economic collapse, and geopolitical brinkmanship. The real tragedy is that Venezuela's crisis was never inevitable. It was the result of decades of mismanagement, corruption, and ideological dogmatism. But the longer it drags on, the harder it becomes to fix. The military's role is the key variable, and right now, it's the one thing no one, not the opposition, not the US, not even Maduro, can fully control. That's why, when people ask me if there's a way out, I tell them the same: there is, but it won't be easy, it won't be clean, and it won't happen without a fight. The question isn't whether Venezuela will change. It's whether the change will be for the better or whether it will just make things worse.